Project ECHO is a virtual learning program that connects experts with local professionals to share specialized knowledge. It enhances collaboration, improves services, and supports professionals, especially in rural and underserved areas, by equipping them with the tools to provide better care. The goal is to reduce service gaps and foster a learning network that improves outcomes for individuals and communities. This ECHO series is sponsored by the North Dakota Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Program. The purpose of the series is to enhance knowledge of the EHDI system. Our goal is to build state and territory level data and measurement capacity to improve language acquisition outcomes for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. ECHO sessions focus on moving information, not people, allowing you to actively learn and become a resource for your community. Each session includes a formal presentation on a designated topic. We encourage you to engage by asking questions in the chat or unmuting during the Q&A. Your participation is essential to the success of our ECHO session. We strive to create an interactive community where presenters, stakeholders, and participants connect and support one another. We encourage you to turn on your camera if you're comfortable and stay engaged by asking questions after the didactic portion and offering feedback during case presentations. Individual privacy is of utmost importance to us. When sharing information, please avoid using real names or initials. Please do not identify any individual's family members, friends, coworkers, or email addresses. Your attention to confidentiality helps, helps create a safe and respectful environment for everyone. To receive credit for your attendance today, please fill out the evaluation that will be sent to you after the session and during the session in the chat. You can earn professional development credits in social work or a certificate of completion for your participation in our Pathways to Language sessions. Your feedback is important to us, so thank you in advance for taking the time to complete those evaluations. Now I would love to introduce our speaker. Allison Setti is a speech-language pathologist, audiologist, and researcher. She is currently the director of the Early Language Outcomes Lab at the University of Colorado Boulder and is the assessment and accountability coordinator for the Early Intervention Outreach Program at the Colorado School for the Deaf and the Blind. Dr. Setti received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she studied language acquisition in children who are deaf or hard of hearing, as well as in children who have Down syndrome. For the past 30 years, she has served as the director or project coordinator on a variety of grant-funded research projects examining predictors of language outcomes in young children who are deaf or hard of hearing. Stop sharing, and Allison, you can take it away.
Okay, well, thank you. How does that look?
We can see your presenter's notes.
Okay, let me see if we can switch out of that. How about now?
Looks
Better?
good.
Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you for your nice introduction, and I just want to thank my friends and colleagues in North Dakota for helping to sponsor this presentation and this whole series, which I've had the pleasure of attending most of the other sessions and thought they were really excellent. So this has been a great opportunity for all of us this entire series. So, and also hello to, I see many familiar faces and names in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to talk today about language acquisition assessment and documentation of outcomes. And I'll share a little bit about some of the language outcomes that we've been finding from our work and some of the predictors of more successful outcomes and some of the characteristics that put some children at more risk for language delay. So as Shelby mentioned, I'm Allison Setti. I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder and also work for the Colorado School for the Deaf and the Blind, which is in Colorado Springs. So our topics today are to talk a bit about some of the benefits of doing formal language assessment in general and with children who are deaf and hard of hearing specifically. And then the bulk of today will be talking about considerations when choosing language assessments. So we'll talk about it in general terms, but also for specific subgroups of children who are deaf or hard of hearing, and also considerations that one would want to make if you're not just thinking about assessing an individual child, but also using the language outcomes that you collect to look program-wide or statewide at how children are performing in terms of language acquisition. And then, as I mentioned, I'll share a little bit about some of the language outcomes that we found from the work we've been doing, partnering with 15 states across the US, and some predictors of language outcomes, both factors that seem to facilitate language acquisition in children who are deaf or hard of hearing, and factors that put some children at more risk for language delays. So let's start with talking about the benefits of documenting language outcomes and doing language assessment. And I want to talk about the benefits for the whole team. So for the children, the families that we work with, the intervention programs, and then also potentially the EHDI program as well. So some of the benefits for the interventionists and the families is that many of the assessments that we would do with young children who are deaf or hard of hearing, and today I'm going to be focusing primarily on children birth to 3 years of age, many of those assessments involve parent input. And by doing that, not only are you enhancing the validity and accuracy of your assessment, but you're also enhancing families' abilities to observe and describe their children's skills. Because often the questions on language assessments are things that a family may or may not have actually thought about in the language acquisition process. And going through those types of questions is actually part of the learning experience in the intervention process. So not only are you improving families' ability to observe and describe their child's skills, but you're also informing them about the steps that are involved in language acquisition. So, what takes us from early babbling and cooing all the way to complex language? What are all those steps? What order do they go in? What phases does a child typically go through as they're acquiring language? And all of that is important information when we have families who are, anxious to enhance their children's language development. Doing the assessments, of course, also objectively monitors the child's progress over time and allows you to identify delays that may exist in a timely fashion. So if you're doing an assessment, say every 6 months, you're not waiting till the child is 3 years old and now moving on to preschool to suddenly realize there's an aspect of language that may be fallen behind that had, in a more timely fashion could have been addressed, and the child would be where they should be when they're transitioning into preschool. So the information that you get from the language assessments is providing a data-driven approach to your educational programming. So many of the decisions you're making are based on personal preferences, families' culture, families' interests, their desires for their children. But we also want those decisions to be bolstered or supported by actual objective information about how the child is doing with whatever choices are being made. So the assessment information that you receive, and if the child's on track, if there's areas of delay, can help inform very important educational and intervention decisions, things like how frequent the intervention should be, Are things on track, or do we need to accelerate the language acquisition process with perhaps more frequent visits? Potential modifications to the communication plan. Is whatever communication approaches that have been chosen, do they seem to be working well for the child? Is the child acquiring language at the rate that the family wants them to be acquiring language and that they should be acquiring language? Or do changes need to potentially be made in the communication approaches that are being used? And then the assessments, particularly if you pick ones that are good for this, are great with identifying next steps. So not only what do we want to see, but what developmentally is the next step in the language acquisition process? What should we be focusing on? What goals should we be making based on what the child is now able to do and what they should be doing next from a developmental perspective? Some of the benefits that are on a larger scale, so beyond the individual child and family, are benefits potentially to the entire intervention program that the child is in, and potentially the entire state that the child lives in with the EHDI program collecting language outcomes. So if a program or a state decides to collect language outcomes on a large scale basis and look not just at the individual child and their family, but look across all of the children in the program, all of the children in the state, that's providing accountability data. And it allows the programs to identify where their strengths are, where their challenges are. They can address those challenges, improve the services that they're offering for families and children. And it also allows them to look at different subgroups of children. So they can identify health disparities. In other words, are there different demographics or different situations or different audiologic characteristics that perhaps are putting some children at more risk for language delay? And then they know that's something that's going to require extra emphasis, perhaps more professional development amongst their professionals, perhaps increased services for certain types of groups of children. So there's a lot of tangible benefits beyond just data collection and monitoring, because you can actually do something with that data to make program-wide improvements. So let's talk about selecting the assessments, because if you're going to document language outcomes, you obviously have to pick an instrument or several instruments that you're going to use in order to collect those outcomes. And so let's talk about some of the things we would want to consider as we select those instruments. And you always want to keep in mind that as you're selecting a language assessment, you want to select something that's going to benefit the entire team. It's going to benefit the child, it's going to benefit the family. If you're documenting the language outcomes across a program or across a state, you want to select an instrument that's going to be good for that as well, so that will benefit the early intervention program as a whole, and also the EHDI program if you're looking statewide. So what do we need to consider if we want to pick an assessment or several assessments that are going to do that, that are going to benefit the whole team, the child, the family, the program, the state? So some of the general considerations, and this would be across really all subpopulations. So we're going to talk a little bit later about special considerations for specific groups of children, but for all children who are deaf or hard of hearing in this birth to 3 period, you want to select an instrument that's going to involve and include parent input. Reason for that is, you know, for all of you out there who work with children birth to 3, and most of you do, you know that on any given day or any given hour, a child birth to 3 is not going to demonstrate all of the skills that they have. It's pretty much just logistically impossible for a child to do that in an hour. And if you catch them on a day where they didn't have a good nap, or they're a little hungry, or they're just not feeling very cooperative, it's going to be even more impactful in terms of not necessarily seeing all their skills. So whereas with an older child, it's very reasonable to sit down at a table and administer an assessment, and in an hour or a couple of hours, collect some really solid information about that person's skills. That's not really reasonable for a child who's in that birth to 3 period. They're not going to demonstrate all their skills for you. That's even more of a problem if you're unfamiliar to the child and family. They're even less likely to demonstrate all of the things that they can do. And so including parent input is critical for getting a complete, accurate, and valid measure of what the child's able to do. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's side benefits to that too, because that's helping the parent become a better observer and more knowledgeable about the language acquisition process. Another consideration that's very important with children who are deaf or hard of hearing, and really, I guess, any population, is that if you're going to take the time to administer a language assessment, you want to pick something that's going to identify delays if they actually exist. So you don't want to pick an assessment that's going to end up with a result where at the end, nobody really believes what you found because it doesn't fit with their impressions of the child. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that because it can be an issue really with any group of children, but there's some special considerations with children who are deaf or hard of hearing, which can make it even more problematic to pick certain types of assessments. The other thing is that you want to pick something that's going to be useful in providing next steps. So again, when we're thinking about an assessment that's going to benefit the child and benefit the family, not just the system, in terms of documenting language outcomes, is you want to do something, take the time to do something that's going to be useful in the intervention process and in the family's day-to-day life. So an assessment that can give you ideas of things to do, things to work on, things to focus on, and what comes next in language acquisition. It's also great if you can find an assessment that has a version that's been normed on children who are Spanish speaking or families who speak Spanish. It's a little more difficult to do that than one might hope. There are a number of tests that are translated into Spanish, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that test was given to a Spanish-speaking population. And so even though it's translated into Spanish, you're still comparing the child's skills in Spanish to other children's skills in English, which is not ideal. So finding an assessment that is actually normed on children who speak Spanish is really the gold standard and what we should be striving for. And then the other piece of it with children who are deaf or hard of hearing is many children use sign language, some full American Sign Language, others sign support with spoken language. And that's a big consideration in picking an assessment, is that you need to pick something that's going to work well in sign language as well as spoken language, and not disadvantage a child who is using sign language as either their primary mode of communication or as part of their communication approach. So why parent input? We already talked about this a little bit. Incorporating the parents' deep knowledge of their child's skills is going to improve the accuracy and validity of the assessment. And as I mentioned, especially true in this birth to 3 period, where you just can't expect that a toddler is going to demonstrate all of their skills for you when you ask them to. And provides an opportunity for families to be better observers of their children's skills and to understand the language terminology that is part of testing, is part of intervention. That allows the family to come to the IFSP table, the IEP table, as a more equal partner, because they will understand terms like pragmatic language skills, syntax, morphology. If they're contributing to the language testing process, if they're just sitting in the background or doing something with the child, that's not a learning experience for them. It's important that they become well-versed in the language that's going to be used in meetings as people discuss their child's future, and how their child is doing. So I talked a little bit about the importance of selecting an instrument that's going to be sensitive to any gaps in language if they actually exist, or delays in language if they exist. And I want to expand on this a little bit more because this is extremely important. Probably with all populations, but near and dear to my heart, of course, the population of children who are deaf or hard of hearing. So why do some tests seem to, what I would say, test high? And I'm sure many of you have had this experience where you've administered a language assessment to a child, you score it up, you look at the scores and you think, wow, the child scored in the average range. But that's not my gut feeling, and that's not the family's gut feeling. We believe that relative to other children, the same age as this child, that this child does have some language delays. This child does have some gaps. Why did they get a score that's in the average range? This is a very common occurrence, and it happens more with some tests than others. Why does this happen? So I'm going to talk about 3 possible reasons that this can happen. One is that many assessments use what we would call a basal and ceiling approach. And the idea behind that is that some tests have many, many items on it. They span from very, very early language skills to much later, more complex skills. And it would be very time consuming to administer all of those items. And really wouldn't make any sense to do that, because if you have a child and they're at the stage of mainly cooing and babbling, there's not really much point in asking about the use of complex grammar. And vice versa. If they're using complex grammar, you don't need to be talking about babbling because they're beyond that stage. So it makes a lot of sense why tests do this, but it can be problematic for children who have language delays, because children with language delays often have splinter skills and gaps. So they don't necessarily develop the language skills of their language in exactly the same sequence and order as typical acquisition. They may be able to do some later developing skills, but not actually be able to do some of the earlier developing skills. Or they may have a strength in some areas of language, but they have some gaps or deficits in other areas of language. And with the basal procedure, what you do is once you get a certain number in a row right, like let's say 3 in a row right, 5 in a row right, depends on the test, what the basal would be. The child will get credit for everything before that, whether they can do it or not. And so a child who has splinter skills and gaps is getting points for language items that they really actually can't do. And that's buffering or bolstering their score in an unrealistic way. So trying to avoid tests that have basals and ceilings can help with avoiding this issue of getting a language score in the end that really is not very representative of the child's ability and maybe actually overestimating where they're at linguistically. Another reason that you often see where tests will test high is that the questions on the assessment are sometimes quite general. And I often, when I meet with interventionists, we'll sit down and discuss, well, what do you think, the test authors mean by this question? What should the child actually have to do to get a point? And that's kind of a problem if you're sitting around and not quite sure what counts and what doesn't count as a correct response. You really want to find a test where it's very clear what the child needs to do in order to get credit or in order to get a point. So just by way of example, there's a very common test, and one of the expressive language items says the child can tell you what he's doing. Well, you could have one child who, when you say, what are you doing? They say eat. And that is the correct answer to that question if they're eating. You could have another child, and when you say, what are you doing? They could say, I'm eating a turkey sandwich with cheddar cheese. Both of those responses will get a point. So 2 children at very drastically different levels in terms of their language development are getting the same exact point for that particular item. So if the test doesn't specify by saying something like, tells you what he's doing using at least 3-word sentences or more, children are going to be credited for sometimes what's really a much more basic response than maybe what the test developers had in mind, but they didn't specify that on the test. A final reason that I want to mention why some tests may miss language delays is that many of the tests in the birth to 3 period go all the way down to 1 month, because we're wanting to measure communication skills, those early pre-verbal communication skills. So many assessments, and really anyone that goes down to 1 month of age, is going to have communication items that are pre-verbal. So things like shakes their head, the child shakes their head no, the child points at things. These pre-verbal communication skills typically develop in a regular fashion in children who are deaf or hard of hearing, provided they don't have other cognitive issues. So it's not an area of language that tends to be problematic for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. They're going to typically develop these nonverbal early communication skills at the same time and in the same way as children who are typically hearing. And so they're getting points for that, rightly so. Maybe they collect 10 points for pre-verbal items. Then as they start transitioning from 12 months of age up to 3 years of age, more and more is expected with formal language, through words and sentences together. And so now that's becoming some of the points that the child should get. But they've bolstered their score with maybe 10 points from pre-verbal items where that's not an issue for them typically in language development. And so it's unrealistically inflating their score for formal language because they're getting points for an area that's typically not a gap for them. And this is really just going to be the case in any assessment that starts at 1 month of age, because that's what the communication skills are from 1 month up to 9, 10, 11, 12 months of age, are these pre-verbal communication skills, which are of course important, but you don't want them to be obscuring any gaps there might be in formal language as the child gets older. So let's take a look at, how does this actually play out? If you look at language tests that have basals and ceilings, have general communication items, have pre-verbal skills that get credit, how do the scores on a test like that differ in terms of finding language gaps compared to a test that don't have those characteristics? So what we're going to look at is the percent in a large sample of children that we've assessed across 15 different states. What's the percentage of children who had language delay on that test? In other words, they scored below the 10th percentile. And all of the children that we're going to look at do not have any additional disabilities that are thought to impact them. So the two tests that we're comparing here are two tests, and let me say I like both of these tests and I like them for different reasons. So this isn't to say that one of these is necessarily a better test than the other, they just are doing something a little bit different. So we're comparing the DAISY-2, which is a general test of language. It's actually a test of multiple developmental areas, but it has two subtests that look at expressive and receptive language skills. And then we're looking at the MacArthur Communication Development Inventory, which is specifically a language test, mainly looking at expressive vocabulary. So we can see in this graph, we have children who have bilateral hearing differences on our left, children with unilateral on our right. And if we look at the bilateral, the lower bar, the lightish green color, 15% of the children demonstrated a language delay if they were given the DAISY. Those same exact children on the MacArthur, 36% of the children were demonstrating a language delay. So we can see that more than twice as many children were identified with language delay using the MacArthur, which does not use a basal and ceiling, which does not count pre-verbal items, and is not general, and it's very specific in terms of what a child needs to do to get credit for something. More than twice as many children were identified with a language delay using that assessment. And it's even more dramatic for the children who have unilateral hearing differences. More than 4 times, almost 5 times as many children were identified with language delay. And when we look at the percentage identified with language delay, when you look at it based on the MacArthur, the 36% for bilateral hearing differences, the almost 20% for unilateral hearing differences, that is much more in line with our research and or not just our personal research, but research across the United States on the language skills of children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Those MacArthur percentages are much more in line with what we know about language acquisition, language delay among children who are deaf or hard of hearing, as opposed to the DAISY, which appears to be dramatically underestimating the percentage of children who have a language gap or language delay. So let's talk about just some additional considerations. If you're not just wanting to measure abilities of individual children, but also to look at program state. One of the biggest things is consistency in your selection of your instrument. Why is that? It's critical if you're looking program-wide or statewide, because you need to combine apples with apples. And as you've just seen, different tests not only measure different components of language, but some are known to test high, others are more likely to develop or to identify delays. And we cannot be combining within a state or within a program, one child's results based on one assessment and another child's results based on a completely different assessment. If you do choose to have multiple assessments across a program or a state, you're going to end up with multiple small samples because you're going to have to look at each of those groups of kids based on the assessment that they took. And in order to aggregate your results across your entire program or your entire state, you need to use one single consistent assessment battery. Not to say that people can't then also select their own individual favorites, because just using one assessment probably isn't best practice anyway. You do want to use multiple assessments. And so one assessment can be an agreed upon, consistent assessment that all children in the program or state are participating in. And then the other assessments can be more of a free choice based on people's individual preferences and the needs of the child and the family. And you want to be able to aggregate across all of your children, because higher numbers when you're looking at group data improve the stability and validity of your results. It's really not group data when you have 5 to 10 kids in the group. Individual children sway the averages too much. You really need to be looking at least tens, if not hundreds of children in order to really get a feeling that you capture a good picture of your population. The other piece, when you are collecting data statewide and documenting language levels and looking at things like, do we have a language deprivation situation here? Are the children acquiring language the way they should be? Are they on track? Is to make sure that an instrument you select is norm referenced. So in other words, it's a test where it has been given to hundreds, maybe even thousands of typically developing children. And so that an individual child's performance can be compared to a large group of their same age peers that are developing language typically. That kind of test is going to give you standard scores and or percentile ranks, and it allows you to determine the percentage of children who are falling within or outside the average range, which is really critical when you're talking about things, concepts like language deprivation, language acquisition. Are the children performing as they should be for their actual age? So one test that does meet all the criteria that I mentioned that you might consider if you're looking at something to do statewide or program-wide, or even just with your individual child or family, an assessment that will be more likely to identify gaps, is the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventories, which again is primarily a test of expressive vocabulary, but also looks at different aspects of language depending on how old the child is. So some additional considerations with specific populations as you're selecting assessments. And the 3 different populations we're going to talk about are children who have unilateral hearing differences, children who use sign language, and children who have significant additional needs. So children with unilateral hearing differences. Language delays with this group of children may be more subtle. And so this is the group you really want to avoid the tests that have a reputation of testing high, and be very careful to select tests that are going to be more likely to identify a delay if it actually exists. So you want to avoid 5 domain assessments. They are very general. They use basic ceiling approaches, and they tend to test very high. Preschool language scale is another very, very common administered test. It also tends to test high. So with the population of children with unilateral differences, if you really want to be sure that you haven't missed a language delay or language gap, I would avoid those 2 types of assessments. Some of the tests that are more likely to identify language gaps, as I mentioned, the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, that's great for the 8-month to 37-month period. And notice it does not start at 1 month of age, so it doesn't have those pre-verbal items that will influence the vocabulary score. The Self Preschool, which is designed for children in the preschool years, is a good instrument at identifying gaps. And the Castles, which is from 1 month to 8 years of age, is also a good choice. Let's talk about children who use sign language. If the family and the child are using sign language, particularly if they're using American Sign Language, where they're making an effort to be a bilingual, bimodal communication family, you want to be assessing not just the child's spoken language, but also their skills in American Sign Language. And we have a few instruments that I recommend for that. One is the ASL-CDI. It's primarily a vocabulary measure, very similar to the MacArthur, but designed specifically for ASL. Another really excellent instrument is the Visual Communication and Sign Language Checklist, or VCSL. Looks at a variety of ASL skills all the way from 1 month to 5 years of age. And then a nice instrument for families that are using both spoken language and sign language is the Sky High Language Development Scale. It's a general measure of receptive and expressive language skills, but all of the items have a counterpart in spoken language and then also in sign language. So very nice for families that are using a combination of those two. And that goes all the way from 1 month to almost 6 years of age. Often, though, we are going to be using assessments that are not specifically designed for sign language. The 3 that I mentioned just a second ago are all specific to American Sign Language. But we are sometimes going to be administering a test that wasn't specifically designed to be done in sign language. And if you're going to do that, you want to have some special considerations about the test. One thing is language tests usually use the word say. So they'll say things like, the child can say at least 10 words. The child says this. If you're administering that test to a family that's also using sign with their child, you want to make sure that you're always saying say or sign. So as you're asking the family interview questions, or you ask the family to fill anything out, you want to make it very clear that in our situation, we're not just talking about do they actually say the word with spoken language, but do they produce the word? Do they produce this language structure, whether it's in spoken language or sign language? Other thing you have to be really careful about is if you're actually administering a test, is that all the words in the test and sentences need to be signable without having to rely on finger spelling. Because if you're talking about a child who's in the birth to 3 period, although very, very young children who have deaf parents are starting to get receptive finger spelling skills, it's not at an equal level to all of the words that they can produce with just straight signs. And so you want to avoid tests where words would need to be finger spelled to a young child. On the flip side of that, and this can be more difficult, you want to also avoid tests where the signs are very iconic. So in other words, they look a lot like the thing that you want the child to comprehend. So let's say, for example, you put out an array of objects for the child and the test item is ball. And so you're signing ball with your, making basically a rounded shape. And there's 3 items in front of the child, and the ball is the only one that looks anything like that, that's a rounded shape. So then if the child picks the ball, you really don't know, do they really understand that word? Or do they just have the cognitive skills to be able to match what my hands are doing to what the object actually looks like? So you want to avoid, especially comprehension tests, where a lot of the signs are going to look very much like the item that the child is supposed to select. And then you also need to avoid tests that are of grammatical endings. So you don't want to pick tests that are looking at the child's ability to understand or produce things like the ing ending, the past tense ed ending, the plural s ending, because those are not features that are part of American Sign Language. Those grammatical morphemes are done in different ways. They're not done by tacking on a few letters to the end of a word. So let's talk now about the last group of kids, which is children with significant disabilities. So that can be anywhere from typically 30 to sometimes up to 40% of the population of children with deaf or hard of hearing may have some conditions in addition to being deaf or hard of hearing. A smaller percentage has very significant disabilities that will be impacting their language. For those children, 5 domain assessments often underestimate their skills. So 5 domain assessments will have a cognitive section, but many of those cognitive items depend on having intact vision. So for children who are dual sensory, have dual sensory conditions, they're likely to not be able to do those cognitive items, not necessarily because of their cognitive skill, but because of their visual issues. Likewise, the adaptive behavior sections of those tests, where you're looking at independent living skills, especially the early items, a lot of them are about eating and drinking orally. So for children who are tube fed, they're going to lose a lot of points. That don't necessarily, so then their score at the end doesn't necessarily reflect their adaptive behavior skills, but just is a reflection of the fact that at this time they're not eating or drinking by mouth. So low scores also on tests in general, even not 5 domain tests, and limited progress on a typical norm reference test can be upsetting and discouraging for families because they're seeing very little progress. And part of the idea of doing assessments is to measure progress over time. So with this group of children, I would recommend an assessment called the Communication Matrix. It's available online. It's designed specifically for children with very significant disabilities. It tracks progress in very small steps so that you can actually see progress over time, even if that progress is slower. So it's looking at how children are communicating, everything from pre-intentional behaviors to, in the more advanced stages of the assessment, use of concrete symbols. Talks about reasons why children communicate. Are they communicating to refuse things, to socialize, to request? And it's a really nice tool to use with children who have pretty significant language delays and are likely to make slower progress in language acquisition over time. So let's wrap up with talking a little bit about some of the language outcomes that we've found from the work we've done with the 15 programs that we're working with. And in particular, what I want to look at is vocabulary size over time. How does children's vocabulary develop over time? That's a 3 period. So this is a group of children who have bilateral hearing differences. They have no disabilities thought to interfere with their language development. And it's based on almost 1,500 assessments. So about 1,499 to be precise, assessments. And this is based on the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory. So what we're looking at here is across the bottom is the children as they get older, right? Chronological age as it goes up. And then the vertical axis is the number of words that they know how to produce or their expressive vocabulary on the MacArthur. And the green line, the higher line, is children who are hearing and how many words they can typically, the average child can produce at each of the different age levels. The line with the squares, the kind of bluish purpley line, is the 1,500 children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And you can see that they are lagging behind in terms of the diversity of expressive vocabulary they have, and that gap is widening as time goes on. So whereas in the very early stages, they're starting out about the same in terms of first words, very early vocabulary, very quickly as they get older, and hearing children are rapidly accelerating in their vocabulary acquisition. Children who are deaf and hard of hearing are progressing and they're learning new words and producing new words, but not at the same rate as children who are typically developing. So we see this vocabulary gap increasing over the birth to 3 period. From 19 to 30 months of age, children who are hearing are typically learning 35 to 40 new words every month, producing those words, saying those words. 35 to 40 new words every month. That is a lot. And that is that rapid acceleration of vocabulary that we learned about in our language acquisition courses. Beginning at that same age, at 19 months of age, children who are deaf or hard of hearing are also acquiring new words, but typically they're averaging about 15 new words per month. And that's not allowing them to keep pace with where they should be from vocabulary acquisition. So this is an area that we all need to be addressing, diversity of vocabulary. And it's so important for later skills like reading and other literacy skills such as writing as well. So what predicts that some children tend to do better in language acquisition? What children struggle more in language acquisition? So for this, we're looking across 450 children that we've assessed. They're from 8 to 36 months of age, all different degrees of hearing difference, bilateral, and no disabilities thought to impact their language development. And this is based on both the DAISY-2 and the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory. So the factors that we've found that put some children at more risk for language delay. And so these are things you want to be keeping in mind as you're working with families, as you're considering amounts of service, intensity of service. The factors that are placing some children who are deaf or hard of hearing at higher risk for delay. One is just older, as they get older. As we saw, the gap is widening. Children, as they're getting older, are more likely to show language delay than when they're younger. And that speaks to the importance of continuing to assess over time. So you might administer an assessment at 18 months, at 20 months, and see if the child is actually pretty much on track from a linguistic acquisition standpoint. But it's so important to assess again 6 months later and then another 6 months. Because often we see children who get off to a good start, sometimes later will start to deviate because they're not keeping pace. And it's very important to keep an eye on that and make changes as needed to keep them where they should be. Lower levels of education of the primary caregiver are associated with higher risk for language delay. If the family is eligible for WIC or other food assistance programs, children who have moderate, severe to profound hearing levels, as opposed to mild to moderate hearing levels, are at higher risk. And children who didn't meet the EHDI 136 guidelines. So in other words, they were children who were identified a bit later or got into early intervention a bit later. They are at higher risk for language delay. So that concludes what I wanted to share with you all today. So I will stop sharing and see if we have any questions.
Thank you so much for all of that information. That was great. I asked a question earlier. Do you have recommendations on assessments normed in Spanish, ASL, etc.? But you kind of already answered that question. But otherwise, I haven't seen any other questions in the chat. You just explained yourself very well that nobody has questions because you didn't leave,
Yeah, I mean, fine, I'll go back to the question that was asked. And as you said, I did mention the MacArthur as being a test that does that. In a sense, though, it is 3 different tests. So the MacArthur Communicative Development Inventory, in its most traditional form, is a test of spoken English. The ASL-CDI is based on the MacArthur, and that's specifically a test of ASL vocabulary. For children who are using both spoken language and then sign-supported speech with some signs, the traditional spoken English version might be appropriate. Most of the words on it do have signs, so it's not looking at ASL structure per se, but it is looking at general vocabulary, whether it's in sign language or spoken language. And then the MacArthur, there is a version that is normed on Spanish-speaking children as well.
Good to know. Let's see. Do you have recommendation? Oh, sorry. Do you ever use the LUI?
I don't personally. I know what the test is, the language use inventory. So no, I don't have personal experience with it other than having, looked at it, read through it. I like it on the surface for sure. And the only reason I say on the surface is because I haven't used it. So I don't know if it would be a test that would have a tendency to test high or would be a pretty good test at identifying language gaps. What I do like about it is that it does cover multiple areas of language, which has pros and cons. I mean, if you're only going to pick one test, it's nice to have something that's going to look at everything from vocabulary to pragmatic skills to syntax. And the LUI the LUI does that. It looks at multiple areas of language. Sometimes tests that try to do too much then don't leave you with a lot of great ideas for goals because they just touched on different areas of language and not looked at one thing in depth. But it certainly seems like a great part of a battery, or if you're looking for something that's going to relatively quickly look at a variety of areas of language, it looks like a nice instrument, but can't recommend it one way or the other from a personal standpoint.
I
It's
know
kind of
that it's,
what you
I know
said.
that it's outside of the 0 to 3. It's really normed on 4-year-olds. But I was at an interesting talk at ASHA a year ago in which they presented information on pragmatics and how that relates later to reading and writing, right? Being able to see other people's perspective, that whole theory of mind.
Mhm.
And the fact that when they took a group of kids who were average on other language tests, but when they gave them the LUI had deficits.
Mhm.
And so there was a whole big research project on that. I want to say out of Iowa, maybe, but so I was interested. Apparently you can use it with kids using different languages because a lot of it is a parent assessment, but yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the pragmatics area. It's so important. As you said, for theory of mind development, for reading, and really just communication in general. I mean, to be able to use your language in multiple different ways and contexts, you know, whether it's to request things or explain things or give reasons for things or convince people, or how to adjust your language if you're talking to somebody younger than you versus somebody in a you know, adult in a power position. All of that is so critical, and that can be an area for children deaf or hard of hearing, even as you said, when other areas of language are looking pretty good in terms of staying on track, that can be an area where there's sometimes are gaps. It's so super important to look at that. We have a pragmatics checklist that we use. It's not a norm test, but I really love it for that purpose and to be able to identify goals and things to work on. But again, as you said, you know, those are not necessarily skills you expect an 18-month-old to be able to do. But as the child's approaching 3, and certainly as they're getting to age 4, that is expected in typical language acquisition. So super important to look at that, whether it's with the LUI or with even more in-depth pragmatic assessment.
Let's see, do you have recommendations as to how to increase 15 vocab words per month to 40 words per month?
Well, there you go. That's the big question, isn't it? So, yeah, you know, I could make a few suggestions. It's a tough nut to crack, because part of the reason why children who are hearing are able to do that is through incidental learning. So they're overhearing, that even nobody's directing anything to them. And children who are deaf or hard of hearing often miss out on that. They often, in order to access the language, either need to be looking at the person talking or they need to be in close proximity. And they're getting often an incomplete signal. So we've got to make up for that, right? That incidental learning might not be happening to the same extent as it would with a child who's not deaf or hard of hearing. So partly I would say is not hiding the bar from families, like having families understand that in typical language acquisition, this is what's happening. Children are learning 35 to 40 words and producing those words every month. This is what we're shooting for. So just having, you know, the bar be clear and apparent, I think is step 1. And then step 2 is also helping families not shy away from using words that their child doesn't know. I think sometimes with children who are deaf or hard of hearing, we want to go to a safety zone. We want to make sure they understand. And in obviously certain situations, that's extremely important. But day to day, throughout the day, it's equally important to be using words that they don't know, that they don't understand, and that they might not understand the first time that they hear or see it. But that over time, repeated exposure in highly contextual situations, the child will learn them. And that's critical too. And all the strategies that we know, the expansion of children's language, pairing known words with unknown words, making sure that as we do say and sign words that the child may not be familiar with, that we are doing it in a context where they can understand it. So whether there's actual, items that can be referred to, or words can be contrasted with other words. So, let's say, for example, child knows cold, but now we want them to know chilly too. So we say things like, "Whoa, look at that penguin. He's out in the snow. He looks so cold. He looks so chilly. Do you think he's chilly? Do you think he's cold?" And where you're pairing the new vocabulary word with the potentially known vocabulary word is another, I think, excellent technique where hopefully families can branch out and be using words that the child doesn't know without fear of losing them or confusing them. And not over relying on certain types of things. So we often see, like on the MacArthur, the child knows lots of animal names. But they don't know a lot of household items. And so it's also just shifting what we're talking about and making sure that we're not just talking about animals or things that are very concrete, but that we're using words that are action words and descriptive words and more unusual things to expand the child's vocabulary. Because it's all about exposure. Nobody's going to learn a word that they haven't heard or seen. It's impossible. They have to hear and see the words, and they have to hear and see them multiple times in a meaningful context, paired with whether it's other words they know or definitions or pointing at objects, and lots of talking. I mean, frequency of talk is important too. So frequency and quality is really the key.
Let's see. Can you recommend a vocabulary test like the MacArthur that goes beyond the CDI-3?
That's so tough. Because the CDI really relies on parent input and is trying to, in a sense, capture most of the child's vocabulary. Certainly can't capture all of it, but there's hundreds of words. Once a child gets past 3, they should be knowing thousands of words. So you can't possibly present a list to somebody and ask them to check off all the words the child could say. It just would be just kind of unreasonable. So then you have to switch to the idea of an administered test where you're showing the child objects or pictures and they're naming them. I use the expressive one-word picture vocabulary test. I do think it tests a little high, but not terribly, and I like it because almost all the words have signs, so I feel like it works reasonably well in sign language. It's also just kind of quick and easy to give, so I don't like it as much as the MacArthur, but when you have to transition when the child turns 3 to a more administered test, among the administered tests, it's one of the ones I like better than others. I also like the vocabulary section of the self, whether it's the self preschool or as you're getting into school age, the school age self. I kind of like, like in the school age self, their vocabulary actually asks children to define words. So as opposed to, just I say a word, I show you a picture, you say the word, you have questions like, what does teen mean? What teen? What does hot mean? And that's a whole new layer of language that is more likely to potentially identify gaps if they exist, because it's going a little bit beyond just the concrete matching of a word to a picture. So I like it, but that's definitely school age, not even preschool for that.
And I don't see any other questions in the chat. I'm just quickly scrolling through to make sure I didn't miss anything, but I think that's it. Yep. Awesome. Well, maybe not. Hold on. One down. Oh, just a bunch of thanks to you, Allison. thank you so much for speaking to us and telling us all of this great information. We really enjoyed it.
Sure. Well, thank you all for being here, for listening and watching, and nice to see everybody. Have a great day.
Yes, thank you. And the evaluation survey link is in the chat for everyone if you need certificates of attendance. And of course, we always love to hear your feedback, so please fill that out. And yeah, happy Tuesday.